be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 73 Insights from the Virtual Meeting. My name is Christy DeMoe-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen Olive is the Director of Policy and Global Domain Name Services for CSC. For over 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies, and is a leading authority on the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers and the Domain Name System. She recently has been named to the Names and Numbers Steering Committee of ECO, Association of the Internet Industry, and has served on various INTA subcommittees. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. We are jam-packed again, another blockbuster ICANN meeting with lots to talk about. We'll start with our usual ICANN overview. We'll then go through, spend a considerable amount of time going through the different ICANN policy development processes that are going on, or PDPs. We'll then kind of get the update on DNS abuse, talk a little bit about alternative root domains. The burning question that is always asked is, what about round 2? So we'll cover that as well. And then we'll probably sprint to the end talking about the GACS issue of concern. So just to review, ICANN has 3 public meetings per year. This is the first one of the year. Usually it happens in March. It's typically a 6-day format. They did condense it down to the 4 days. This is still in a virtual format. We're not in person. This is really intended to be a community forum. It is very similar to like kind of the old meeting structure, but it's really lots of working group meetings and lots of kind of discussions around topics of interest. So just to make sure everybody kind of understands what we talk about when we say ICANN. So this is kind of a high-level organizational chart of ICANN. So ICANN has, a board of directors, and then they have a staff. And then there's a number of supporting organizations and advisory committees that kind of make up what's called the ICANN community. And, we will focus mostly in this webinar series around the GNSO, and that's where there's the gTLD registries, CCTLD registries, the registrars, different interest groups like intellectual property, business constituency, ISPs, those types of things. So that's where we spend most of our time. We often also talk about, there's a dark gray box all the way kind of to the right bottom, the Governmental Advisory Committee. So this is a group of representatives from various national governments, usually like the different ministries having to do with telecom or any kind of like web infrastructure, that type of thing. That group is kind of very central to a lot what happens, a lot of the discussions that happen around ICANN, because they're looking at the different policy recommendations that are coming up through this like bottom-up consensus policy, multi-stakeholder model. They're kind of looking at things through the lens of sort of the public interest. So you'll see kind of, these policies come up, and then kind of the GACS. It was very much more at the end of policy making that they would kind of put their thoughts out there, but as time has gone on, and particularly the last couple of years, we've seen them get involved in the policy kind of discussions, if you will, much earlier, kind of giving opinions and kind of indications to ICANN as to where they think maybe things are off the track or maybe where things are going well. So the first PDP we'll talk about is a relatively newer PDP, and again, that's policy development process, is the transfer PDP. So the GNSO Council, which is the Generic Name Supporting Organization Council, launched this new 2-phased PDP in February of 2021. We're really looking to determine if changes to the policy are needed to improve the ease and security and efficacy of the inter-registrar and inter-registrant transfers. So You know, when GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, went into became fully enforceable in May of 2018, you know, ICANN had to change a lot around WHOIS, and we've talked about in prior kind of webinars of this series is that how the WHOIS is going dark. So that really had a pretty large impact on the transfer process because there's emails and information out of that WHOIS that gets used for the kind of make the process work and to kind of notify the parties, both you know, losing and gaining, that kind of got blown up, if you will, from the WHOIS information becoming less available. So they really need to kind of relook at this process and determine, you know, like, do there need to be changes, especially with the form of authorization or the FOA, how auth info codes are used, things like NACing, which is sort of like negative acknowledgement of a transfer. Also looking at change of registrant in that process, as well as emergency situations or emergency action that needs to be taken when there's kind of a transfer that maybe is unauthorized or something has kind of gone in a way that it should not have. So this team is targeting a kind of mid-2022 to publish its initial report. So that's what this PDP is all about. So in terms of status on this PDP, there's been substantial progress around the gaining and losing form of authorization, the FOA, and auth info codes. And so a lot of their recommendations are really starting to firm up for its initial report that, again, they're targeting for mid-2022. The next area of focus is really around reversing or denying transfers, often called NACing. That was really what they spent most of their time talking about during ICANN 73, you know, trying to get some input from those who were in attendance. So a little bit refreshing here. I feel like this one's on track. We'll be talking about others that are taking much longer, but this PDP, I think, is in kind of going at a good pace and likely will hit its target date for its initial report. So next up is the IDN EPDP. So let me kind of decode that acronym soup there. So IDN is Internationalized Domain Name, and EPDP is Expedited Policy Development Process. Now, an IDN is one of those domain names in non-Latin script. So when you see, you know, a domain name in Japanese characters or Arabic characters, things like that. The internet doesn't handle IDNs great. It's getting better. It's definitely way better than when I started, for sure. But it's still, you know, a work in progress, is I guess how I would categorize it. And so really what the GNSO Council is hoping will happen is they'll get some policy recommendations on the definition of all gTLDs and the management of variant labels, as well as how IDN implementation guidelines should be updated. They haven't been updated in quite some time. So this is something that's really been one of those things that ICANN has been talking about needing to do, but with so many other things going on, it's kind of been on the back burner, but this one has now kind of gotten on the train tracks. They're planning to provide some recommendation across the 7 topic areas that I kind of list there. I think, you know, what you should kind of understand is across these topics is some of them are highly technical. They're about like how the internet kind of handles, how the, you know, kind of the computer infrastructure handles or browsers handle these types of domain names. And the, you know, the other part of it is a lot of kind of policy work that, you know, having to do with like string similarity and, you know, objection handling, things like that, things that we saw during the new gTLD program. So I think this could be potentially a little bit of a sleeper IDN where a lot of people may not pay attention to it too much early on. But I think as time goes on, we'll see that this will grow in terms of interest and importance. So in terms of where we are on status, the working group has basically gone through its first pass of a lot of the questions around topic A, around the definition of gTLDs and variant gTLD labels, kind of using the RZLGR standard. That's, again, sort of a technical thing. We won't go too much into that in terms of what the RZLGR is. But nonetheless, they're now working on some of their kind of initial discussions or deliberations on the charter questions around same entity. So, just kind of think of that set of questions as, so a registry operator is operating a string, and now they want to have variants of that string. The questions of should that be run by the same entity or not, how that would work, how that could be granted, those types of things are the questions now they're tackling. So, like I said, this one's a relatively new PDP, but they're kind of starting to get into the real kind of meat of it right now to, get towards some initial recommendations. So that's where this one is. So next up is the IGO EPDP. So let's kind of break that acronym down. So that's the International Governmental Organization Expedited Policy Development Process. So I put in parentheses there specific curative rights because this issue has been part of prior PDPs. So this has kind of been an ongoing discussion. The work appeared kind of like the discussion is both part of the IGO, INGO, so that's, International Governmental Organization, International Non-Government Organization, Access to Curative Rights PDP, as well as part of one of the work tracks in the Rights Protection Mechanism PDP that kind of sprung out of the new gTLD program, kind of like post-program reviews, kind of launch of the TLD's reviews. What this really boils down to is that these different organizations, think of like Red Cross, United Nations, other kind of organizations that are kind of have these international charters. Their acronyms, their kind of names or short forms of their names are things that are very kind of inherent to who they are, yet they are often not trademarked. And some of that has to do with sort of like the type of organizations they are. Not possible to trademark, or there's not a lot of budget to trademark if they can. The challenge there is how do they try to recover those strings if somebody were to register them, or could there just be like this block on them? The kind of the blocking part was part of the initial kind of curative rights PDP that happened. But, this kind of issue of jurisdiction and, whether or not there's like jurisdictional immunity, all these kind of very hyper legal issues are still, quite honestly, not fully defined in the context of domain names. So that's what this working group is kind of tasked with to try to. There were 4 recommendations that came out of that IGO, INGO, Access to Curative Rights PDP, and now they're kind of trying to kind of square these issues around URS, which is the Uniform Rapid Suspension System, and UDRP, which is Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy. These are mechanisms that are widely used by trademark holders in the domain industry to recover or take down domain names that are infringing. So, we're trying to work kind of those issues, but for these IGOs and NGOs, and, should there be some kind of special process or scaled down process? And, what about how the courts are used? There's just a lot of kind of things that still need to be hammered out. So the initial report was issued in September of 2021, so last year. Public comment ran through the end of October. And, we're now at a point where they kind of have to take the next steps. So next steps are kind of to finish working through the public comment to the initial report, to kind of make any adjustments to then issue a final report. The final report is expected before the next ICANN meeting in mid-June. So, this is one of those issues that's very, very important to the GAC. It's not, I would say, an issue that, brand owners are following it, but I think largely, it's not brand owners who are going to kind of run into conflict here with the IGOs and the INGOs. So we'll continue to follow this, but this is probably, of all the PDPs, the one that's probably on the bottom of the pile for most brand owners. So since I mentioned the rights protection mechanisms, PDP, and the last discussion on the IGO, EPDP, let's cover the RPM, rights protection mechanisms, PDP now. So just to quickly review, the PDP was kind of split into two phases. ICANN loves its phases. Phase one covered all the rights protection mechanisms that were applicable to the new gTLD program that launched in 2012, so things like the trademark post-delegation dispute resolution procedure, trademark clearinghouse, sunrise and trademark claims and services, as well as the aforementioned Uniform Rapid Suspension, or URS, dispute resolution procedure that enables brand owners to take down domain names based on trademark rights. That's not a domain recovery, it's an expedited takedown. That was what was covered in phase one. Phase two is meant to cover the UDRP, to basically review the UDRP to make sure that nothing there kind of needs some tidying up based on our learnings from the new gTLD program, round one, that launched in 2012. So with this PDP, we're kind of starting to really get close to the finish line. You'll remember last year, top of last year, the DNS Council unanimously approved the phase one final report. They sent that recommendation report to the ICANN board. There was a public comment that kind of ran through almost the end of May of last year. And then finally, the top of this year, so in January, since the last ICANN meeting, the ICANN boards voted to adopt all 35 final phase one PDP recommendations, and has kind of handed it now to ICANN staff in the Global Domains Division to basically proceed with planning. So they're going to be setting up an IRT, an implementation review team, and it's kind of simultaneously, over the last probably 6 months, the phase two RPM of the PDP, looking at the uniform dispute resolution review, has been underway. So we're starting to close this one out. This has been a long haul, but we're starting to near kind of the end route on this one. So now let's talk about probably the most watched PDP. This is the WHOIS Temp Spec EPDP. So the way this all started is back in May of 2018, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was becoming enforceable. And up until that point, kind of the ICANN community was trying to figure out how they could reconcile the GDPR with ICANN's WHOIS rules and different contract provisions that ICANN had with registries and registrars around WHOIS. They were kind of trying to figure out how that could be worked through. Policies could be potentially quickly tweaked, etc. But it was a much bigger issue than kind of a year's worth of work. So what ICANN ultimately had to do is in May of 2018, because there was no resolution to that conflict, they had to issue something called a temporary specification, which basically allowed registrars and registries to redact or not publish information in the WHOIS in certain fields that were considered fields that would contain personal data. So we talk about that time as kind of when the WHOIS started going dark. And so a PDP, once that temporary specification was issued to kind of hold down the fort, if you will, an EPDP was created It was ICANN's first EPDP to basically give the community a year to develop policies around this. So a working team, an EPDP team was brought together. Their work was divided into 2 phases. Eventually there was a phase 2A that came out of this too, but phase 1 was all about kind of the collection and handling of WHOIS contact data and kind of requests for WHOIS data. So really looking at those WHOIS fields, you know, what was still necessary, what could be considered personal data, how it should be handled. You know, the challenge there really became over time of like, again, the GDPR protects personal data. You know, how do you kind of resolve the natural versus legal person issue? There was also some challenges around the feasibility of using the uniform anonymized, looking at the feasibility of using uniform anonymized contact email in the WHOIS. So that kind of issue lingered in phase 1, eventually became an added phase 2A. And then phase 2 was intended to really deal with the access to the data by registrars, registries, ICANN, and other third parties. So this is where the new acronym SAD, or the System for Standardized Access and Disclosure, comes in. And this is really kind of like the system, the kind of whole mechanism by which you could request data, receive data, if you were had legitimate interests. So this was the EPDP that, you know, kind of started the whole EPDP trend. But it's one, even though it's an EPDP, an expedited policy development process, we find ourselves 4 years later still talking about it. So let's break down where we are on each of the phases. So phase 1, the report, what's really remarkable, they had a year to issue a final report. The team actually issued their final report in February of 2019, so under, kind of like they did it in record time, issued a report on what they felt like the new kind of registration WHOIS should look like. That got approved by the ICANN board in June, and then the ICANN board basically said we need to assemble an implementation review team, an IRT, to implement, you know, work through the implementation of this new registration data consensus policy. This team has struggled. Like I said, they started their work in June 2019. We are now in March of 2022, so almost 3 years out. They've struggled. There's been behavioral issues that actually had to pull in the ombudsman's office, kind of, you know, having to do with sort of conduct and the way people were talking to each other and working together. There's been shifting regulatory environment. You know, data privacy is an enormously hot topic, something that's being addressed by many governments across the globe. Also, there's a lot of policy and stakeholder dependencies. There's things that, you know, there's just a lot of cross-section here with a lot of other ICANN policies. And there's kind of a finite number of stakeholders that are involved in all these things. And, you know, there's only so much work that can be accomplished at one time. So this has moved very slowly. And I think this has been far more complicated than anyone, quite honestly, anticipated. So that doesn't stop people from growing impatient. The GAC is particularly impatient. They keep on asking, like, where are you? Where are you? When is this going to come out? The WHOIS has been, and kind of WHOIS accuracy has been an issue for the GAC for as long as I can remember. And, you know, rightfully so. I think that is an issue that does have very serious public policy implications. So there's been these calls for, like, you know, we want a detailed work plan. So the IRT did show up to this ICANN meeting with a very detailed work plan. And when you look at this plan, It's currently projecting that their kind of work will be done early 2023, late Q1, early Q2, but then also kind of has this line that says, you know, the registrars and registries project that it will take about 18 months for them to implement, because we're likely looking at, you know, significant changes to the WHOIS, and so that involves systems and changes to how systems operate and how systems depend on certain pieces of information. So I don't think that news was, I think people kind of knew it wasn't going to be, they weren't going to be done soon, even though it kind of been on this rolling 6 months, like we'll be done in 6 months, we'll be done in 6 months, we'll be done in 6 months. But I think that was a real kind of eye-opening experience for people to see that kind of look that we still got a whole year ahead of the team working, and then 18 months after that. So yeah, like looking at the end of 2024, I think optimistically to have these kind of phase one recommendations implemented. So if that timeline didn't make people so happy, and understandably, I mean, this WHOIS challenge with the WHOIS going dark has caused so many problems for brand owners, for security of consumers online, like security and fraud investigators. They rely on this data. Law enforcement relies on this data. So kind of having the WHOIS go dark has been super, super painful and has caused significant harm. But, you know, as much as that kind of timeline, I think, caused some head scratching, the phase 2 stuff is also something that's kind of status is something that's got people, you know, searching for an answer, just seeming like there's got to be a better way. So there was a lot, you know, when the EPDP phase 2 team issued its final report in August 2020, there was pretty significant negative feedback that basically felt like what was proposed was going to be really hard to implement, really expensive to implement, and overly kind of administratively burdensome. And, you know, the intellectual property, law enforcement, business, kind of all have lined up and said, like, we are not really convinced that this SAD is the right way to go. The GNSO, though, did approve, and the ICANN board then asked for kind of the initiation of something new. They kind of created a new phase of the process here called an operational design phase, or ODP. And really, it was in response to that feedback, and you know, ICANN was feeling like, how can the board make a decision and without really kind of knowing the feasibility and the costs and the risks and the timelines? How could they really make a decision? And so they really wanted to understand that, and that's why this ODP was put into place. And part of this ODP is something called an Operational Design Assessment, or ODA. Yes, we love our acronyms. So this was a new thing that kind of was put out there, a new step in the process. A lot of people kind of frustrated, again, like here's one more step at the 11th hour. But I think there was quite a bit of support to kind of really, let's get down to understanding what this thing is, because I think when we do see that, there may be some second thoughts. So on January 25th, the ICANN staff did deliver an ODA to the ICANN board, which is currently being reviewed. And let me just share some highlights. So basically, you know, ICANN will need to outsource much of the work needed to not only develop SAD, but to operate it. They estimate, this ODA estimates that the SAD development and implementation will likely take 5 to 6 years. Costs for development and implementation would range from 20 to 27 million, and annual operating costs would range from 14 million to 106 million. That is a wide range. ICANN would charge fees for accreditation, requester verification, and disclosure requests to try to recoup costs. It seems clear that SAD would also increase risk to ICANN, everything from kind of litigation to data privacy issues, and could increase cyber risk. And SAD determined to be in what's called the global public interest, and that's sort of a new framework that's been instituted in response to requests from the GAP. But even though kind of staff determined that, after in consultation with others, so they didn't do it independently, determined that SAD would be in the global public interest, ICANN is not convinced that it's in the interest of ICANN or the ICANN community. So I'm not quite sure where we go from here. I think this one, I kind of have a very strong feeling that, SAD is not the way to go, that we're going to need to, there's a lot of other ideas on the table and companies kind of saying they've got a solution. This is going to take some more time, is the bottom line, which, as mentioned before, is hugely a problem for brand owners, fraud investigators, security investigators, law enforcement. So this is really starting to come to a point where I think people are kind of saying that ICANN needs to find a solution to this that isn't going to be as expensive or as long, and that hasn't yet, I think, fully materialized. And finally, status on Phase 2A. The final Phase 2A report was published. It was approved by the GNSO at ICANN 72, so the last ICANN meeting. The report contains 4 recommendations. The ICANN board did approve the 2A recommendations at ICANN 73, so this meeting, and they've now directed ICANN staff to create an implementation review team. So, this one has gotten through the hurdle of the ICANN board vote, so there's no ODP or ODA or anything like that with this one, but this will go to implementation review, and we'll see how that, if that gains quick traction. And for our last PDP of this session, the new gTLD subsequent procedures PDP. So this PDP has really been focused. It's been an ongoing PDP for a number of years. It really was one of those post kind of new gTLD program reviews on all the kind of policy and procedures on the first round of new gTLD. So they needed to determine kind of what changes need to be made to the original kind of GNSO recommendations and implementation. So this PDP is a bear. 40 separate topics, kind of broke into multiple work tracks, and you can kind of see the broad work track topics there. So this was a pretty hefty PDP, a lot of heavy lifting here. So this PDP has been plodding along since July 2018 when the initial report was published for public comment. It ultimately got approved by the GNSO in February of 2021. Was then given to the board. Generally, the board under ICANN bylaws has 6 months to review and approve. There's still some issues where it's still some uncertainty around closed generics, mandatory and voluntary personal interest commitments or PICs, as well as how the proposed standing predictability implementation review team, or SPIRT, will work, and how GAC inputs to that happen in relation to kind of emerging issues. So ultimately what ICANN did, instead of approving, they initiated a subsequent procedures operations design phase, or an ODP, like we talked about back in the WHOIS Temp Spec. So this again is kind of a second ODP that's now been requested. So the ODP will really look to see what those potential risks are, the anticipated costs, kind of resource requirements, timelines, dependencies, interactions with the global public interest framework. There's significant work there that needs to get done. It'll include, just like we had in the WHOIS, Temp, Spec, PDP, include an operational design assessment. That'll be delivered to the board. The board's basically requested that this ODA be delivered within 10 months of initiation, and the ODP, which will include the ODA, that work began on January 3rd of this year. So we're not looking to see that until kind of late this year. So it's been a very long road on this new gTLD subsequent procedures, but this is kind of like a new step that's been put in, and we'll be kind of watching this one for the next 10 months or so. So as you can see, there's a lot going on the policy front within ICANN. There's, not only PDPs going on, there's IRTs, there's ODPs with ODAs. It's a tremendous amount of work kind of happening simultaneously, and a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily like discrete, meaning it only travels in one lane. There's a lot of kind of crossover, and as this is all going on top of all this is this issue of DNS abuse. We've talked about this before, and we're going to continue to talk about this, and this is something that we at CSC are really, really passionate about, because the domain name system is being abused. It's a chronic and growing problem. The problem is magnified by outside events. We've talked about COVID before. Let's now, right now we have the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That is causing all sorts of abuse. There's challenge here, though, is there's no common definition of what exactly qualifies as DNS abuse. No agreed upon definition. But, look, the statistics don't lie. It's a huge problem. It's growing. It's affecting the global economy. It's affecting real people every day and affecting businesses. So this is a problem that is not going away, and it's something that we will continue to focus on and push for there to be continued focus on. Now, a really, I think, good development in this is the EU Commission recently issued a study on DNS abuse, or domain name system abuse. I think, policymakers have a really important kind of role to play here in terms of trying to move this issue forward. There's been a lot of talk, but really, let's start putting pen to paper. Let's come up with a definition, right? So what was really great to see is the EU Commission study on DNS abuse. It came out in January, the end of January. It actually references a bunch of research that's been done by CSC throughout 2021. They took a stab at defining DNS abuse, and they defined it as any activity that makes use of domain names or the DNS protocol to carry out harmful or illegal activity. Sounds like a fine definition to me, a good start. The study found that EU ccTLDs are by far the least abused, kind of in absolute terms and relative to their overall market share, and that new gTLDs are the most abused group of TLDs. I think a lot of us knew that, but it's good to see that there's kind of that recognition by the EU Commission. There was a bunch of kind of recommendations in the report, but just to kind of highlight a couple of kind of recommendations and opinions. It's a pretty lengthy report. It's like, I want to say it's like 170 plus pages. But, read the executive summary. You'll get a good view of it there. But, they've kind of recommended things like registries should verify the accuracy of registration data. Also, that CCTLDs, should provide kind of a scalable and unified way of accessing complete registration WHOIS data. Similar to gTLDs, we kind of had a new protocol put in place, the Registration Data Access Protocol, or RDAP, and it really standardized the WHOIS output, because CCTLDs particularly, every one of them, the way that data outputs is in different formatting, different order, and it really makes kind of searching that data very difficult and kind of parsing that data very difficult. So they're kind of saying that, they recommend the CCTLDs kind of get with the gTLDs and kind of come up and kind of follow a standardized protocol and kind of a way to have a system where that data is stored similar to the centralized zone data service that's maintained by ICANN. Now, it doesn't help you with the redacted data, but at least it has everything kind of standardized. Also, there's this, the strong feeling that addressing abuse cases through kind of this very rigid, lineal kind of path where it's like website operator, registrant, hosting provider, reseller, if there's any, and then registrar, just doesn't work. It's just not appropriate. It doesn't enable DNS abuse to be dealt with at the speed and efficiency that it needs to be dealt with. So couldn't agree more with the EU Commission on that. So what is ICANN doing about DNS abuse? This has been super, ICANN has tried to provide a forum for discussion, but they don't necessarily feel like they're the right party to run the discussion. Meaning, that would put them closer to content than what they are really comfortable, kind of policing content than what they're really comfortable in doing. So currently we have this very kind of patchwork approach. Again, there's questions around, is it their remit? Is there kind of the right tools? Is there right compliance effectiveness, those types of things? Most feel, in fact, that the ICANN, the contracted parties, need to do more. There are some joint efforts, but largely voluntary. The GACT has a public safety working group, the PSWG. They've been working with various stakeholders to, talk about, the different domain-generated algorithms associated with the botnets and malware, kind of messaging malware, and mobile anti-abuse work group on results of kind of a survey of cyber investigators. Kind of individual and national governments are kind of sharing ideas. And the CCTLD registries are looking kind of at new rules they can impose or experience that they can share, things that have made them have less DNS abuse. But again, it's very kind of like little silos of discussion going on. So without a real kind of clear owner or clear path on trying to resolve the kind of, or mitigate the issues around DNS abuse, the best thing you can do is think about how you can protect your organization. So, right now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the threat is high, extremely high. Many national cybersecurity agencies have issued alerts. So CISA has the Shields Up alert. The NCSC has an advisory. This conflict in Ukraine is very much, Russia versus the West. And, it would not be surprising for pro-Russian hackers to really go after Western brands, to make an example, to use their domain names to carry out DNS abuse, or to use the websites on those domain names as billboards for a political cause. So, we're recommending kind of domain security protections as a first line of defense. Your organization's zero trust model to prevent cyber attacks basically originating from either malicious domain registrations, compromised legitimate domain names, and email spoofing. So we've put together a domain security checklist to help enhance your cybersecurity posture. These are things that your organization can do right now to help kind of shore things up. Oftentimes security teams are looking at the firewall, all the hardware, software, the things that they have in-house to help, kind of protect your organization. But the domain name system operates outside those walls, those firewalls. And so there are things that your organization needs to do to kind of like plug those holes. And they're always, oftentimes when we talk to organizations, these are things they're not thinking about. So I really encourage you to kind of reach out to whoever's in charge of cybersecurity in your organization and make sure that they're kind of following the domain security risks and making sure they're taking care of domain security for your organization. So let's talk about kind of the things that you can do right now. So you can adopt a defense in-depth approach for domain management security. So, eliminate your third-party risk by assessing your domain registrar's security, technology, and processes along with your DNS management provider. This is something we focus a lot on at CSE. That's why we're the most security-conscious provider out there right now. You also need to secure vital domain names, DNS, and digital certificates through implementing two-factor authentication. Make sure you're regulating the permissions to your domain portal, both normal and elevated, basically watching for any changes. You want to monitor DNS activity and deploy DDoS protection. You also want to use security measures like domain registry locks, DNSSEC, DMARC, CAA records, and redundancy on DNS hosting. It is, remarkable how many organizations basically rely on one DNS infrastructure, and oftentimes not an enterprise class DNS infrastructure. So redundancy there is critically important. Secondly, make sure you're continuously monitoring the domain space and key channels like marketplaces, apps, social media, email for brand abuse, infringements, phishing, fraud. Basically identify domain and DNS spoofing tactics such as homoglyphs, cousin domains, keyword match, homophones, registered domains that could be high-value targets related to your brands, things like homoglyphs and country domains, to mitigate the risk of the bad actors using them, and also identify trademark and copyright abuse on web content, online marketplaces, social media, and apps. And I really encourage you, CSC just issued a press release around a really exciting new product that we have that's powered by our new domain sec platform. It's called 3D monitoring. I really encourage you to check out that press release. It can really help you here on this continuous monitoring side of the fence. It's really quite a product. Also, third, you can leverage your global enforcement, including takedowns and advanced techniques in internet blocking. So, leverage phishing monitoring and fraud blocking network of browsers, partners, internet service providers, and security information and event management or SIM systems. Use a combination of actions to enforce on IP infringements and fraud. So things like, primary enforcement actions include marketplace delisting, social media page suspensions, mobile app delisting, cease and desist letters, fraudulent content removal, and complete threat vector mitigation. Then you have secondary enforcement actions, which include registrar level domain suspensions, invalid WHOIS domain suspensions, and fraud alerting. So, a lot that can be done here. Then you have, from a tertiary perspective, enforcement actions include things like the UDRP, Uniform Rapid Suspension System, or URS procedures. You can acquire domains. There's in-depth investigations and test purchasing. And then also just use a range of technical and legal approaches for enforcement. it's really a case-by-case thing, guys. Like no one size fits all, but certainly, you know, there's a lot that can be done, and things that we're happy to walk you through and help you handle. Then fourth, confirm that your domain registrar's business practices are not contributing to fraud and brand abuse. So, you know, it's really something that is interesting. So, you know, out in the world there are enterprise class registrars, of which there are less than a handful, quite honestly. And CSC is one, and in my opinion, the leading. But most other registrars are consumer grade. So they're registrars that are selling domain names to the general public, to kind of small startups. They are not built for security. They are built for speed and convenience. And so the following issues are often common with consumer grade domain registrars. So they're, you know, doing things like operating domain marketplaces that drop, catch, or auction or sell domain names that contain trademarks to the highest bidder. There's also, you know, they're also doing domain name spinning and advocating for the registration of domain names containing trademarks. So how many times have you gone to a registrar's website, you type in the name that you want, it's not available, and they have all these suggestions for you? That's name spinning. And you know, when they name spin, they don't care that your trademark is in that. And so they're encouraging people to register trademarked domain names. So that is not a business practice that you really want to encourage or endorse, because that contributes to fraud and brand abuse. Then there's also the monetizing of domain names containing trademarks with like the pay-per-click sites. Many of these consumer grade registrars, you know, if you put it on their DNS, guess what? There's a pay-per-click site that's also generating some money for them. And then frequently occurring breaches resulting in DNS attacks, phishing, and business email compromise. So look, there's a lot there, I know. Please, you know, if you want to talk more about this stuff, reach out to us, reach out to your CSE representative, go to our website, hit our contact us page. We'll be happy to help you, walk you through this, explain how there are just really easy things, and many of them, you know, a lot of them are not things that are going to really cost you any more money, but some of them absolutely will, but they're the right protection that you need, especially in times like right now. So beyond DNS abuse, another topic that was kind of pretty extensively discussed and kind of debated during ICANN 73 was alternative root domains. So I'm not going to be able to do justice on this topic in just a couple of minutes, but let me just give you some of the high level here. So, you know, one of the kind of most common alternative root domains is blockchain domain names. So these blockchain domain names, they do not operate on the regular DNS. You have to, and kind of end users on the internet have to install kind of plugins to their browsers, and some only operate on some browsers, and they're not browsers that are typically used by the general public. But nonetheless, these blockchain domain names are decentralized. There's really no governance into how they're created. It's just technology enabled. And currently there's an estimate of about 3.5 million TLDs on the open source Handshake blockchain alone, with the prospect of about 100 million by 2030. And there's also hundreds of thousands of others spread across various platforms. These were some statistics shared during ICANN 73. Now, when you kind of compare that, ICANN has about 1,300, 1,500 if you include the ccTLDs. Those are the TLDs that they're kind of managing on the root. So, you know, ICANN has issued an advisory around blockchain domain names. I recommend you take a look at that. But, you know, this is the problem, is that, you know, really there is, you know, there's really no protection for end users. There's no protection for brands. There's no care or concern about ICANN or the multi-stakeholder model with these blockchain domain names. And, you know, it's becoming a little bit of a brand protection and trademark nightmare, right? Because there's no WHOIS, there's no way to kind of look for these things. There's no way to use the UDRP or the URS to enforce. It's just this big decentralized kind of, set of names. Often, most of them purchased through a bidding process that can go from like pennies to, some significant cash. But, there really is not, this is really something that, we've kind of seen before, kind of, there were domain names that like someone would get a domain name like us.com, and then they would sell off of that what's called kind of a server configuration, so a third level name like mycompany.us.com that really wasn't a domain registration. It wasn't like you could find it in the WHOIS or in the zone file, couldn't file UDRP, couldn't file URS. And over time, the person who owns, like say that us.com, they could just kind of pick up and say, sorry, I'm going to just use this domain name for my own use right now. And the people who invested in purchasing that name and any kind of website or email or other things that were operating off of that, they were kind of out of luck. And, there's a lot of concerns that that's kind of the way this is going, especially, there's a project going on within ICANN right now where they're looking at name collisions. And it's called the Name Collision Analysis Project, or NCAP. And one of the things that is expected is when round 2 comes, there's going to be all these collisions with names that are being applied for through the ICANN process. And what's going to happen? There could be people who spend very significant money on these blockchain TLDs and ultimately wind up having nothing. So I think from a, it's one of these, it's like a new technology that, the industry is watching closely, but there are no rules of the road. And so at this point, it's really a brand protection problem that everybody is trying to figure out. So like I said, I can't really do this topic justice in the short amount of time that we have, but it is starting to get talked about. For a lot of time at ICANN, this wasn't something that was getting talked about. So we're going to continue to monitor this and follow this issue really closely, continue to look for ways on a brand protection front that we can see how we can help clients protect their brands. So this brings me to timing of round 2. My prediction stands it's 2024 or later at this point. I do think this blockchain kind of alternate root domains or something that may put some pressure on to kind of get things going to try to stem that off. But there's just so much going on and the WHOIS situation not being resolved. I just don't see this happening before 2024. And as I sprint to the finish here, trying to be respectful of your time, just want to wrap up with just, again, mentioning the GAC. They do issue a communique at the end of every meeting. They actually issued it post-meeting this time, which was interesting. But, the GAC's voice is really growing in the ICANN community, and I just think, you need to watch the GAC to really understand what's going on and what's important at ICANN. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go into each and every one of these, but here's a quick list of the issues of concern that were listed in the GAC communique. Global public interest framework, subsequent rounds of new gTLDs, accuracy of registration data, EPDP phase 1 recommendation implementation, DNS abuse mitigation, and universal acceptance. That is what's high on their list right now. And like I said, ICANN goes as the GAC goes, so keep your eye on the GAC.